Welcome everyone to Blinded by the Light edition. Yeah, I can't be bothered to bring down the blinds. On top of that, I play Priest. I also play Paladin sometimes, so I like to roleplay as I have total control of the light in my hand. That feels pretty good. So today we're talking about, of course, the raid recap on top of yesterday's Mythic Plus recap of how things have been going on this week 9 of Season 3 and also the first week of patch 10.2.5. Now, unfortunately, patch 10.2.5 didn't actually bring any balance tuning, so there isn't really anything new major that is happening now that wasn't happening last week, but we are getting, just like we are gonna get them for Mythic Plus, like we mentioned yesterday, we're gonna get some balance tuning in basically a couple of days that might or might not affect the performance of the specs in the raid. So of course, as we look at the total results and even the specific results, boss by boss, etc, etc, it's always good to be reminded of, to keep an eye out on for the specs that are about to be buffed, since that's what the balance tuning is gonna bring. This next reset just buffs Frost Decay, Unholy, Feral, Survival Hunter. You also have Red Paladin being buffed, Shadow Priest being buffed, as well as Arms Warrior as far as DPS are concerned. So it's good to take a look at this. We can still go back to compare these results with what happened in the past few weeks, but also keep an eye out on for all of the specs that are bound to receive some positive changes in a couple of days. Now this one right here, week 6 was the past. It was 3 weeks ago at this point. This was the one where we were talking about some random results being a bit volatile and likely not permanent, like for example Devastation Evoker casually and randomly becoming the second best spec in the raid in overall numbers. Also Affliction Warlock looked kind of weird being so high. Then we moved on to week 7 and as expected, Devastation Evoker lost way more. We continue to have some more specs at the top consistently, like Havoc, like Demo, like Subtlety, but a few of them were jumping up and down in the rankings, even going up 1 week later. Things normalized even more. Affliction fell down more than the previous couple of weeks. Devastation went down more than the previous couple of weeks. We stabilized with Arcane as a consistent top performer right now in the raid after the buffs of a few weeks ago given to mages, compared to the results we have right now in terms of the raid. We still have Arcane there, we still have Subtlety, we still have Demo, we still have Havoc. These have been more or less the specs we have seen towards the top of the results in the raid when looking at all of the bosses combined. We also had a few others like BM, like Outlaw, and Fury Warrior recently as well around this level. What is new, or what continues to be surprising, is the continued growth of Fire Mage. We were already aware of Fire Mage becoming a borderline flavor of the month meta pick in Mythic Plus, but we were kind of aware that Arcane Mage of the 3 mage specs was the one doing the best in the raid. Now Fire Mage is also doing quite well for itself when looking at globally all of the results in the raid. As we keep getting more and more kills, it's more and more relevant to be able to see how specs are doing on Tindral. Yes, the amount of logs are still quite few. This is just for 10.2.5, but even all the way back to 10.2, the number of logs were very few for Tindral, so we are still in a work in progress situation. It's also why, one of the reasons why we are seeing Devastation or Affliction rising more in the rankings, because they are currently getting very high results on Tindral, likely from padding on the roots and the trends, which is what gets them to have a higher results on average in the overall meters. It's still, of course, too early to pay too much attention to the results of Ferak, given the logs being in the dozen only. So you have this interesting results like this Shadow Priest log, which is a grand total of 3 players apparently having quite a different results on this fight. Now, as mentioned, the wildly different power levels of specs depending on the fight can be impacted even more in a few days with the balance tuning, right? So these are the results right now on average, boss by boss, in terms of DPS. If you were to combine all of the results, this is how much the specs would be doing. As we mentioned, sure, you can have some outliers. You can just look at Council and find out that, you know, Elemental is pulling off way too much damage compared to BM. It's a 90,000 DPS gap in just a single boss fight, which means if you go back to the average, it's gonna impact it a lot. So it's gonna show up Elemental as being only 7,000 DPS behind Beast Mastery on average, when it's not really like that. What is interesting though, when looking at the overall results, is to also get an idea of how much the changes coming in a couple of days might impact the performance of all of the specs that are planned to receive buffs. Yes, it won't mean too much from just this overall DPS rankings, because you're looking at a terrible, super low, C-tier awful spec like Frost, and then you look at their overall damage and they are actually beating Red, and they are, matching someone like BM. Buffing the spec though, regardless of which ranking, which aggregate of number, or which tier list you're looking at in terms of results, what you can look at is the changes given by the buffs, right? Because no matter which one you're looking at, no matter which number you're looking at, Frost DK is about to be buffed by 4% in damage. So even taking this tier list as an example, 4% of 216 is going to be roughly 9,000 damage. So this 216 is likely going to go into the 225,000 range, which in this example, it would be matching Havoc, it would be matching Arcane, it would be matching Outlaw. And these specs are quite high right now. Arcane, Havoc, Outlaw, they're doing quite well. So at least according to the overall numbers, buffing Frost would make it a quite competitive spec compared to the others. Not as good should be the result for Unholy, which is slightly below Frost, and it's getting buffed the same amount in the raid, 4% more damage. We can go over for our example and swap to a completely different aggregator of numbers, Archon, straight from Warcraft logs, to see at the purely the throughput of the specs, purely the numbers of the specs. Other outputs being buffed, although this one is not nearly as high, is Arms Warrior. The buff to Arms is more AoE related, because besides Cleave, which is not used, they are buffs for more AoE effects. So the single target buff is only about 3% or so. But looking at multiple metrics, the 3% buff from 208,000 average DPS would bring them to about 215,000. At the moment, Fury, their counterpart, is at 219, so the difference would be quite close. Even if you switch to something more relevant like single target, like pure boss damage, for example, the damage to bosses, Arms and Fury would get much closer. Right now the buff would actually make Arms pass Fury in terms of single target damage. That's what is perhaps more important in terms of damage increase, the supposed slight better performance of Arms for single target and just straight up one-on-one damage, which is what might give more window for warriors to play Arms instead of Fury, because at the moment Fury is very popular and Arms is not. It is possible that after this buff, Arms will get its fair share of play in the raid after this buff coming in a couple of days. Another buff, this one is not going to have nearly as much of an impact, is to Shadow. Well, first of all, because Shadow is not splitting time with another spec in its roster, in its class, it's not being underplayed because there is a better option. Right now, it's just being underplayed because it's not very powerful. The buff to Shadow Priest, when it comes to single target, it's bigger for AoE, it's in the 6 to 7% damage for AoE, but for single target only is around 4%. So again, looking at, for example, single target damage only, damage to bosses only, getting buffed by about 4% or so would bring your average from 180,000 to about 187,000. So it would allow you to get all the way up here, right? So at least for single target, it's a decent increase. Even if we go back to the overall numbers in the raid right now, getting buffed by 4% would bring your 250,000 all the way up to 260,000. So you would be able to get closer to some of the better performing specs. Not these, even changing the aggregator of ratings and results, buffed by 4% would bring you to about 215,000, which is again mid to average and just not one of the worst ones in terms of overall results. One of the other changes is the one going the way of Feral. This is a larger change in Mythic Plus, even upwards of 10 plus 12% AoE damage in Mythic Plus. In the raid, again, it's smaller. It's in the 3% range, maybe 4% range of buffs. Feral is again doing fine in single target in terms of damage profiles in the raid, being buffed by 4%, similar to Shadow, who would go from 180 to 188. In terms of Feral, it's even higher. They would go from 182 to 191,000, which would, bring them quite high in terms of single target damage. Obviously, once you shift from damage to bosses to just overall all the damage, that's where Feral drops to the bottom. If you switch the ratings, Feral is to the bottom. If you switch again, Feral is almost to the bottom. But in terms of numbers, it is the lowest in terms of results overall, together with Elemental, Frost, Shadow, and Survival. So another necessary buff going the way of Feral. So we can expect a relevant improvement to Feral in terms of results in the raid. It will be up to see in terms of popularity, because at the moment Feral is not being played too much. There are way more balanced Druid players, even though balance is not doing strictly that much better than Feral in the raid. We will see after this buff and their increased performance just how much of a shift we will see from balance to Feral. Much like the shift we could see from Fury to Arms, for example, after the buffs going the way of Arms. The last of the buffs, which has been the more interesting one to decipher, is the one to Ret Paladin. We talked about it in Mythic Plus, just the same as we will talk about today in the raid, because in Mythic Plus the overall damage of Ret was already strong. So with this buff they were going to be towards the top of the overall damage meters in Mythic Plus. In the raid, the power is not nearly as strong, because even if we go to the single target results, they're still doing quite poorly. Whether it is single target or whether it is just overall damage on all types of damage profiles, they are still towards the bottom. This buff to Ret will bump them similarly well past the 220,000 average compared to the average they are at right now. So this would allow Ret to average now at the very least around this range, purely based on the numbers of the buff of Ret. Even if we switch to something different, like here, for example, you can see Ret at 250. They will be able to get into the 262,000 range, which is close to this level of DPS specs, right below the better performing ones. Even if we switch to U.GG, which puts Ret already into the S tier, mostly due to their massive popularity in the raid. Even then, with this tiny number compared to Havoc, they will now be able to get much closer to and almost match the results of Havoc in terms of performance. That is why we were talking about this one being the more questionable, because this spec was also already doing quite well in Mythic Plus, for example, and it was already a very popular spec in the raid. Even if you're weak, there's a difference. There is a difference between being Survival Hunter weak and Retribution Paladin weak, because even if the numbers tell us that Survival is technically being even or slightly ahead, Ret Paladin, by all the metrics we are looking at, Survival is kind of on a similar level to Ret. Ret Paladin is being played approximately 23 times more than Survival. So the weight of buffing the two is not the same. It's more relevant to buff a very underplayed spec like Survival compared to a spec that is already very popular like Ret. And this is the only one of the very popular specs that are receiving a buff. Because looking at the other specs being buffed, you have Survival, you have Frost DK, you have Arms, you have Feral, you have Shadow. Those other specs being buffed, all at the bottom of the popularity. The only outlier has been Ret in terms of the buffs being given in a couple of days. Those are the results for the DPS, as well as what might change in a couple of days once the tuning comes in. Now, some room to talk about the possible tuning of the healers, because it's going to be quite short, since Resto Druid is mostly just getting mana changes and not proper throughput buffs. You have Resto Shaman though, that is getting healing increased by 5%, and you have Holy Priest getting a few buffs to their healing. This is also relevant, similar to what we talk about Ret being an interesting buff, because Ret was already very popular or doing very well. For healers in the raid, it is somewhat similar as well, because when talking about the HPS in the raid, while it might be understandable to buff Holy Priest, because Holy Priest is the lowest HPS in the raid right now, not the same for Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman is already matching pretty much all of the other healers outside of Mystiver Monk, and barely close to matching Discipline. If we change metric, if we go over to Warcraft logs, the healing, the mythic healing results show still the very big outlier of Mistweaver, but then Resto Shaman is, it's doing fine. It's around a similar level of being healthy. So it's interesting to see them being buffed by 5% in terms of healing, because it doesn't look like they needed to match this bump of HPS. The one that was more logical, of course, was the buff to Holy. It's a 4, maybe even 5% at very best buff to the healing of Holy Priest, so they should be able to now match or pass these two other specs towards the bottom to be at a more average result. Even looking at these numbers, this HPS now with a 4-ish% buff should comfortably break into the 200,000 HPS and start matching Paladin and Evoker. Even if we switch over here and go at healing in the raid, again, this HPS should get into the 270,000, leapfrogging both of these two specs to go into the average results in terms of HPS. But overall, there has definitely been less of a focus in the changes given to healers compared to the more important changes, the possibly important changes going the way of DPS. So we have made our list of what could possibly change in the near future in just a couple of days, tomorrow already in NA, in terms of the balance tuning coming this next reset. Of course, we want to be able to see the effects of this tuning immediately, so we will have to wait at least 1 week or so before we actually get to see any proper meaningful effects of this tuning. But it's good to have this video as a reference, this video as a guide, so that we can come back in a week and check the effects of the tuning. But for today, on this Monday, it's time to leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, as I am pretty tired, I need to recharge my light energy before I go and work out a bit.